Hey everybody, Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist, composer, and producer Brendan Rothwell.
Hey, Raul, how you doing?
Doing great, doing great.
Excellent.
Many of you will remember Brendan from Music on Our Radar, and we had the opportunity to listen and enjoy his more recent release, Sentiment. Right. And we can certainly come back and talk about that. But as always, we like to go back in time and find out your beginnings. How did you get started in music and on bass?
Yeah, well, music for me started very young. So 2 years of age, I was, shall we say, shown a piano keyboard. And, you know, at that age, you're so young, you don't make decisions. So they're made pretty much for you. And I'm, to this day, thankful it was made. So my mother is a concert pianist. And decided that I would learn piano. So 2 years old, off we go. Piano was great. It's a fantastic grounding for anybody musically from a theory perspective. Moved from there to getting a place at a choir school. So I actually sang. I was a chorister for about 5 years, from the ages of 7 to about 11 and a half, 12 years old. This is all in the UK, obviously. And in fact, in a place called York. So I was a chorister at York Minster. So I've already, by the age of sort of almost a teenager, I've had about a decade's worth of musical training, very classical, singing in Latin, learning things in Latin, you know, all, of course, to set me up for a move to North America in my later years, for sure. So, you know, ran with the classical piece. I played violin, so now I have violin and piano and vocal skills in music. And then the bass, specifically for me, happened in 1986. So I heard what was then the current album from Miles Davis, which was Tutu, and the specific piece, other than, of course, the amazing sound of that trumpet, but the sound of the bass. And I'd never really heard anything like that. I'd heard orchestral basses, you know, upright basses. I'd heard some jazz upright bass, but this was the first time I got to hear the kind of Fendery, slappy thing that Mr. Miller does completely uniquely. And that was it. I was absolutely sold. Got into a comparatively inexpensive jazz copy bass by Hohner, if you remember when Hohner used to make electric basses and guitars and things. And that put me on the path of bass. And within a year, I was playing in a couple of kind of rocky bands, and then I got into some jazzy stuff. And it really went from there, moved to London in my very end of my teens for music, played in sort of rock pop type bands in London for a while. Ultimately moved to Canada 2005 and been here ever since. And now, of course, relatively established in the contemporary jazz, the smooth jazz world, whatever that really means. For me, what it means is as an audience, which is a wonderful thing as a bass player that likes to play lead melody lines, you know.
There you go. Well, it is fascinating. We can certainly, in the whole genre kind of evolution as music is moving along, because you have, as you mentioned, Miles, kind of the classic jazz, if you will, which had evolved even further from the origins of the jazz. That's kind of stuff that we were hearing from, you know, Duke Ellington, Count Basie,
right?
And as it was moving along, and then as it's moved into this whole new thing, and it is a very loose definition because there's a lot of room for, I'm going to say, creative license within smooth jazz, and it is no longer just smooth. I think some people think of it like elevator music, but for those of us that listen to Sentiment, there was some funk in there, and there's some other elements, and more players that are on the smooth jazz side of things are throwing in other elements. So it continues to kind of evolve and develop, and, you know, have more, I don't want to call it contemporary, it's just borrowing, because again, there's not an absolute lane to stay in, which is really fabulous creatively. It allows you to kind of reach out and snag some stuff, and including like world music. You see so many of the smooth jazz players embracing a Brazilian bit or, something else. But I digress, obviously doing a lot of talking. So all of this training, you came to Canada, got going with smooth jazz, recorded Time on My Hands, and then followed it with Sentiment.
Right. Well, Time on My Hands, that was the first recording I did under my own name. And, I played for other people, and I played in the jazz world and the rock world and the metal world. And I really thought, Raul, that it was down to me to pull it together and actually finish an album and get it out under my own name. Mm-hmm. So I did that. I was fortunate. I had a couple of local guys here that actually supported me in terms of some playing, a couple of keyboard guys. And I also hooked up with Pooji Bell, who, from a bass player's perspective, is like the dream drummer, right? So he played for Marcus Miller for about 15 years, on and off. Mm-hmm. Number of his albums he's on, many of his tours. I saw him playing with Marcus, and we hooked up actually through LinkedIn. To this day, I think he thought I was the act's manager as opposed to the guy. So he was very formal to begin with, but actually Pooji, of course, isn't that formal. He's a very funny guy. So we figured it out, and we did a Dropbox thing, and I got this amazing drum track back. And that really was sort of me pulling everything together and saying, okay, here's an album, it's my name, and start to build a bit of a brand. Mm-hmm. I promoted that. I used a promoter in the US to push that off to radio. And I also worked with the guys at smoothjazz.com, which is, arguably the world's biggest kind of online radio network right now for that type of music. It did really well, which was a positive surprise. I mean, you can't go into these things with expectations of everything, right? Mm-hmm. But it did well, and we charted for a few weeks back in 17. Then the pressure was on me personally to, okay, how do I improve on this? How do I change it up? What more of my playing style can I bring in? I wanted to use more of the Dingwall on the new album as well. So it's not exclusively Dingwall, but there's a lot of Dingwall 6-string melody playing going into that as well. Then it got me to a point of expectation within that piece of the industry, because I'd done pretty well with album 1. What's album 2 going to be? Is it as good? Is it not as good? What's he doing? Has he digressed from bass? Is he more piano? All those things, of course, come into question. Very pleased to say it was received massively favorably by radio and promoters. Certainly the US market. I mean, that's huge for this type of music, but around the world. And of course, here we are in the lockdown of COVID-19. And absolutely amazed by the amount of people that do connect. They actually take the time to connect through my website or even phone me. I have a couple of guys in Hawaii that call me regularly just to say, hey, played it again, man. We love that bass. When's the next album, kind of thing. So, there is some positivity in the darkness that we live in today, thankfully.
Yes. Well, and one of the highlights of Sentiment, at least in my mind, is that especially the way it's engineered. We were able to hear a nice amount of your playing. And it's interesting, as you'd mentioned earlier, with orchestra, symphonic, the basses are there, but usually they don't stand out at all. It's all part of that collaborative fabric that you get, with the end result being everybody all blended together nicely. Very homogeneous. Whereas with non-bass driven recordings, a lot of times you can have amazing bass players mixed down to a level where you hardly know they're there, unless you're a bassist and you're looking for them. Right. And I don't know that there's anybody that hasn't tried to lift a tune and you're going, I'm having trouble picking up what note is this? What run is it? Because everything else is on top of it. But with Sentiment, it was front and center. It was nice and clear. It wasn't, I'm going to say, it didn't overshadow everything else, because I did hear piano and you hear the other instruments, but it was crisp enough and clear that we could really get a good feel and understanding of what you were saying and what your voice was, which was fabulous. Which is probably a good time to talk a little bit about gear, because you mentioned Dingwalls, and of course, the fact that you're playing on 6 strings will make some of our 4-string brethren howl at the moon, because they get a little upset over having 2 more strings, but they don't have to play it. You do. Tell us about your gear.
Sure. Well, we talked a couple of minutes ago about where it all started for me. So I did start on a real 4-string bass. For those watching who are upset by the concept of a 6-string bass. And I mean, to this day, I still play 4-string bass every day. It's where it began. It's where it still is foundationally. If you can sit down with a 4-string Fender Jazz and play, the rest of it takes care of itself, right? The 6-string is a little different. So I went through a 5-string phase. I still play 5. But the 6-string, I first played a Dingwall, it's probably 10 years ago or so now, at some trade show, gear show thing I was at, and met Sheldon Dingwall. And he walked me through the kind of physics of this thing. And it's actually very simple. I mean, they have the Novak's fan frets, as you know. But he said, think of it like a grand piano. And so a grand piano is horizontal. If you flip it and now hold it against you, that's why you have the multi-scale length, right? So thicker strings are longer, thinner strings are shorter. And then the fan fret piece comes in. So your intonation is, without argument, way more accurate. Now I can go get my Fender Jazz 4-string and play it, and we can all hear what we now are used to as bass players. It's slightly out. It's the normal thing of that's how fretted instruments work. What Dingwall is trying to do is not take over the world. What they're trying to do is utilize physics and scientific thinking, mathematical thinking, to correct that anomaly. They're not saying it's wrong. It's the natural sound of most guitars. But if you want to play that high range and get the kind of intonation that you really need for clarity, that's the way to go. So Dingwall I've been playing, well, probably 7 years, maybe 8 years now, that particular model. It's the Afterburner 1. It's an amazing instrument. And they're so light, physically so light to play as well. So although it's a big neck on a 6-string bass, it's actually a joy to play. So that's where Dingwall, sits in. And as you mentioned on Sentiment, the bass was clear and clean and it wasn't hidden away. Hopefully that was the case for both the lead and for the bass line, because that was the intention. And of course, I'm fortunate, as we talked about with my training, that I can play these different instruments. And so Sentiment was all me. I wasn't using another player for anything on that album, so there's nobody to hide or hide behind. If you don't like the piano, you don't like my piano playing. If you're not into the bass, you're not into my bass playing. And,
yeah.
I mean, it's not for everybody, right? But we do over time find our musical voice. And part of that, of course, is the sound of the gear that we use. And a big piece of it is how we think musically as well. So I think the combination of such an early start on piano and a pretty good grasp of harmony and melody and where those things sit maybe helps me get more out of a 6-string bass at the high end than a 4-string player who just doesn't want to move to a 6-string bass, right? And 4 strings are great. I love them, for the record. Play it every day. So I've never left the 4-string bass world. I just add to my arsenal of what I can do.
Absolutely. Well, and I think part of the key things, and I'm glad you mentioned even the whole fan fret concept, because the bass is relatively a young instrument. When you put it in the grand scheme of string instruments, especially electric bass,
right.
more so. If it weren't for people thinking outside of the box a little bit and going, what if I do this? I think the greatest form of flattery is imitation. I remember when early on I would go to a NAMM show and the only basses I saw with fan frets were Dingwalls.
Right.
Now I go, there's hardly a booth that you go to that doesn't have some model with fan frets.
Right.
And so you kind of go, okay, this obviously is something. And the same is true with headless instruments. Yeah.
For sure.
Back in the day, it was all Steinberger. Across the room, you'd go, that must be a Steinberger. It doesn't have a head on it. Now, everybody is building, and then the combination of fan frets and headless instruments as well. So it's these little tweaks and evolution. And it doesn't take away from some of the original stuff, but if we have the opportunity to improve and, expand the range of what we can do with it, again, the kind of job that you have at hand, what you're trying to put forth as a front player, as you are when you're doing what you're doing, you want to be able to have a clear melodic approach on your high range as compared to somebody who is doing the very honorable, I'm not making less of it, job of laying down a groove for the rest of the band to do their thing on top of. Each one has its own place, but the right tool for the right job. It's like you can't have only a hammer in your toolbox. You might need some
Right.
other tools
Absolutely, yeah. And
as well.
the fan fret headless thing I was checking out online over the weekend. There's some new Ibanez basses that come out headless and fan frets, and I look at that and I think, wow, there's a ton of opportunity in something like that. Whether it's 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it needs to be. But yeah, you're right. It was always Steinberger, right? Then the Status basses came along, if you remember Status, and it was Rob Green, right? It was the Status guy, and they had the graphite going, and Mark King got one. They put some LEDs down the neck, and the rest is history, right? But amazing sound. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's another way for a bass player to musically express where they're at, because standing at the back playing bass with a drummer, that's a great place to be.
Yeah.
Until you need to be at the front taking the lead guy job, if that's what you choose to do. And I mean, there's so many amazing players that take that sort of solo approach, the front player approach. There's some great bass players who only ever want to be at the back with a drummer doing the bass thing, and there's a few kind of hybrids, but again, back to the 4-string, 5-string, 6-string argument, go get someone like Victor Wooten on a 4-string bass and just learn. Just sit and watch and listen and learn and think and apply. And that's how we actually progress. It's not only gear. Gear is the thing that helps us execute on the thought. But what sparks the thought is players like him, for sure.
Gotcha. Well, and as we continue down your sound chain, so we've got a Dingwall and other basses. Then for amplification, you're a DNA player.
Yeah. So DNA, I got into, the DNA speaker cabs, I think probably four years ago, maybe 5 years ago. There's a little store here in town in Calgary. I know the guy that runs it. He's a great bass player. His name is Neil Bentley, and he really can rock out on his Sadowski. He runs this music store, and he said, hey, come and try the DNA cabs. So I knew of them. I'd never played through them, and went along and tried them out, and absolutely hooked. I mean, such a tuned sound, like really, truly tuned sound. So I got a couple of the 12 cabs, 12 to the horn, and I was running those on an older bass amp, really up until quite recently. And then DNA and I started talking about, hey, we have these amps and we hear what you do, and it's kind of a cool sound, and you should try them out. So now I'm running on their 800 amp, which is a dream to use. I mean, it has an onboard compressor that would kick most studio compressors, quite honestly. It's one of those little things that it's a nuance, right? It doesn't go on or off. It beautifully sweeps in the compression, and whether I'm playing a Dingwall active 6-string low B, or whether I'm playing a 20-year-old Fender Jazz passive bass, it manages to bring those things to life. So yeah, I mean, DNA, the history of DNA, and the guy that is DNA and everything that he's worked on, from mixing desks to other amplifiers over the years, you bring that combination of knowledge into now basically a range of 2 amps and a bunch of cabs, and you can cover everything. I've heard and sort of met online other endorsing artists, and it's everything from the 6-string high smooth jazz world to rock acts that you'll shake in your boots, right? These DNA cabs. Love them. And I mean, equally still working on my sound, right? I'm working towards a new recording right now. And so as I'm writing for that, I'm bringing the DNA system in here and starting to really fine tune some of the EQ on that thing as well. So yeah, check them out.
Absolutely. Well, and I have found, especially with the 800, the sound out of the box is so what I wanted to hear that I don't do anything to the EQ. I have everything set pretty much straight up. Right. And that seems to be kind of the consensus for a lot of players, is that they haven't had to tweak the knobs an awful lot. I remember when at one point I have an older Eden World Traveler, and we'd had some company. They had a child that came with them, and the kid had twisted my knobs to different places. And then I started playing it, and I'm like, oh no, what's happening with this? And I had trouble finding where I had been before, because I'd had to kind of nudge them and ease them into a wave pattern that was functioning for me. But if anybody comes and visits with my DNA, everything is straight up. So if they move anything, I just put it straight up again.
Right.
And
Bring the kid over. Don't lose my sound. It's
there
easier.
you go. There you go. So amazing sound. I couldn't agree more. Now in the chain strings, what choice of strings are you playing on?
Yeah, well, Dingwall, so the Dingwall range for their own bass, I use those. There's a few other brands out there that are being used by Dingwall players now, but Dingwall's own strings, really cool. There's a guy in the back that you recognize.
Lee.
He uses them. That's not a reason to use them. It's the reason to use them because he has such great tone. So I use those on the Dingwall exclusively. It's a multi-scale instrument, right? So you've got to kind of look around and think. I've chatted to other Dingwall players. There's a couple of other brands out there for sure, but these are always reliable. And then, primarily on the other basses, I've been using high beams. There's a Marcus Miller sort of endorsed high beam string. That's pretty nice, certainly on the Fenders. And then Dunlop, just the regular Dunlop super bright stainless steels. I bring them in here from an online company in the US, mainly because they do a good deal on shipping. I live in Canada and things get very expensive here for sure by comparison. But yeah, Dunlop, super brights, 40 gauge, regular kind of no high maintenance, just out of the box, up we go. But again, it's funny you ask about strings. That's one of those things that as you get older physically and you learn hopefully more from other people who know more than you, you learn a lot of those little tips and, things like putting the little crook over the bridge saddle when you put new strings on and all those things that when you're a kid player, you don't know because changing strings, that seems like a lot of money for something that I don't need to do, right? Yeah. Try playing a Dingwall and not having a fresh set of strings on that and then go for a clean tone, right? So it's a huge piece and, it's part of I would say really a regime for bass players. There are players out there who, they have their own thing, their own sort of approach to that, and there are some players that actually need that slightly less bright sound. I don't play a lot of dub, but if I did, right? So there's many ways to approach that. But I like to try and not complicate those aspects of playing. I enjoy playing too much to necessarily use up all my time on purely gear or strings or those. They're very important aspects for sure. But I kind of think if you've got a tone that's working, you've got a sound that's working, and the feel of those strings is working, then by all means, shop around. But why would you change it if it's working right now? So I'm happy with what I use at this point for sure.
Got you. Now, between the instrument, you've got this great bass, you've got the strings that you like, you've got super amplification, instrument cable. Do you have a preference on how you're connecting these two elements?
Yeah, and there's been so many pieces of research on this, right? And, power cables and, okay, I get it. Do I have a preference? I don't know if I truly do. I know what I use. I've actually used Monster cables for a long time. They're actually really, really accurate. So if you get a longer run cable, like I have a couple of 30-foot cables, right? And there's really no perceptible difference to their 20-foot cable. There are some brands out there that maybe cost a little less money, but you run a 30-foot cable of those and your tone is not going to be the same. Doesn't matter what strings you're using. So yeah, Monster's been pretty good over time for sure. There's a lot of new gear out there as well on the cable front. One brand in particular that I keep looking at with a kind of sense of envy because they have all these funky manufactured colored connectors, and we'll see where that goes. I need to chat to those guys at some point this year as well. But yeah, I kind of stick with what I like on that front.
Gotcha.
I've had other people sort of throw cables my way and say, try it out. I'm like, well, it's great. It's a cable. It works. It's not really going to change anything significant for me in terms of overall tone.
Sure.
So yeah, keep it clean.
Well, and, there's the sound quality also. There's durability. I think with a lot of touring musicians, these things will take a beating. If you're the smaller band and you take careful care of your equipment and you're not some roadie throwing a bunch of stuff in the bag and around, it tends to hold up a lot better. And so there's the durability and the sound quality and all of those things. Now, I think you use, at least in my estimation, a very, very clean, clear sound, but do you integrate any pedals or anything additional into what you're using?
Yeah, I do. And I went through, I guess in my late teens, early 20s, I went through that phase of just having a pedal for everything, right? I was listening to bands like The Cure, and so you need a chorus and a phaser and you know, everything, right? Under the sun. I still have quite a few pedals that I use. I would say that the main go-tos for me, although this changed with the arrival of the 800 amp, of course, because the compressor's so good, I tend to use Boss pedals. Off the shelf, out of the box, they do the job really, really well. I have their compressor. It's actually a beautiful thing, the more recent version that they brought out. I use the OC2, the octave pedal, mainly if I'm playing fretless, because I think anybody over the age of about 25 has heard of Pino Palladino. And if you're over the age of probably 35, you own records by people like Paul Young, but Pino arguably made sell because of the bass sound, not because of the singer's voice.
Yes.
I love that sound, you know, and it can be overused very easily for sure. So it's kind of, you know, at your own peril, use with caution, but in the right place, it's a killer tone. So compressor, octave. I've played around with some overdrive stuff over time as well. I think, you know, in the rock world where I play from time to time, it can have a place. I think as well, though, depending on the amp and the bass setup, you can get enough sort of grungy drive from most heads, if that's what you're looking for. But I've certainly played around with those many years ago, but I'm not really a distortion guy these days as I get older, you know.
Got you. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned the versatility, because I'd seen some of your videos, and you've got kind of recently, you've had kind of a combination of some metal stuff, and there was a kind of a smoother thing, just a whole combination, which is, again, it's just another testament to your versatility beyond smooth jazz. Not that there's anything wrong with having a big focus in something, but you were holding it down with the whole metal thing too. So I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, the metal thing. I don't wear this shirt when I'm doing the metal gig, by the way. This is my smooth shirt, I guess.
There you go.
So we talked about it briefly earlier on. You know, the rock metal. I mean, back in the day, I'm a Brit originally, right? So it was heavy metal. That's where this stuff came from. And I played in a couple of more rocky outfits when I was, you know, starting out on bass in my teens, early 20s, as I said. I love it. So although I now have this beautifully, wonderfully large and faithful following of people that like the jazz piece that I do, I love rock music. You know, I go see Steve Vai if he's touring. I go see Joe Satriani if he's touring, and I listen to them as players and listen to that. It's wonderful stuff. What happened for me recently is that actually a guy I work with in my sort of Monday to Friday gig, he's a communications wizard. So he does corporate communications, and he's also a really funny guy and a very genuine guy. And he came to me one day and said, hey, I play guitar. And, you know, for years I've worked around sort of corporate environments as well as having my music. And people look at you, oh, yeah, he plays a bit of guitar. Like it's, oh, that's nice. You know, one day he'll grow up kind of thing. Yeah. And so, you know, one day I grew up and here we are. And my buddy Omar grew up and wow, can he play? So he and his writing partner are putting together this, it's progressive metal, which is kind of code for it's intense. And they're long tracks. We did a track in a video, probably the one you saw was for a track called The Asylum. Mm-hmm. And we went out, it was late last year, to a full-on film location just outside of Calgary here. It's been used in a couple of proper, you know, film productions. And they lined up a full film crew. I had my own smoke machine guy. It was like being back on, you know, the rock gig in '92 kind of thing. Yeah. And yeah, they've put this amazing video together. The music I love, I mean, it is intense, right? Anybody watching this who is watching because I'm a jazz guy, go to my jazz stuff. Maybe don't go down the Hayoka's Mirror avenue because it can be a little heavy. It's very, very cool stuff, and it's been put together by two guys who are truly dedicated to getting this right. They're going to be promoting their music into Europe and certainly the US throughout the course of this year into 2021. Of course, our current COVID-19 situation may determine the timing of some of that. And as far as touring goes, we could chat for weeks about where that may or may not be going for any musicians at this point, right? The act is Hayoka's Mirror. They're all over the web. Their video is a thing to behold. do not watch it late at night on your own. It's a little scary.
Moving along, as we know, again, with the COVID, it has changed a lot of people's plans for the future. But in general, what are your thoughts? What are you going to be doing? What's coming down the pike?
Yeah. Well, I've got 2 albums now under my own name. They're out there. I've been very, very focused for I'd say the last year really, on building the concept and building the brand. As a solo artist, I write all the music now. I'm recording all the music, every instrument. I have to be very, very careful that I keep an eye on brand and make sure that I can get the brand out there and have people start to get involved with that as well. Also, it gives me great opportunities for musical collaboration. Putting an album together from scratch on your own is not an easy thing to do. It's a ton of work. It's a ton of emotional work and mental work and all those things. Totally worthwhile. It is, though, a lot easier if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I kind of heard what you do, I kind of like what you do, and I see this brand thing everywhere, and let's get involved. So I've done a few projects already in the last 6-7 months. A sax player, actually from not a million miles from you, a guy called R.L. Walker. He has an album out now. Again, we're back in the jazz world. We've left the scary prog metal. And so we did a track together, and his first single on his album is a collaboration with me. So I did some lead bass for him, and it's beautiful. Another band, actually a former Brit like me, he now lives out on the eastern side of Canada, a guy called Johnny Fraser, and his band is Cold Jack. So I did a track for them. I think end of summer last year, it came out on an album that they released, and now he and I are actually working on some more material for an album project that he's looking to put together throughout this year and into 2021 as well. But the brand concept for me is huge, and I see it. So we've talked about DNA, we've talked about Dingwall, we've talked about Fender. Anybody watching any of these interviews with you probably plays an instrument, right? So they're going to know those brands. Most people can kind of draw the Fender logo. It's been around for long enough. It proves the value of brand, right? And what I didn't want to do was necessarily be known only as a rock player 30 years ago, or only known as a jazz player 30 years ago and now. It's a versatility piece as a musician that I think keeps you fresh and also keeps you current. And so if you can switch from the Hayoka's Mirror world of wow and come into the R.L. Walker world of sax and bass and everything's chilling down, proves your versatility as a player. So I'm super proud of that, and I'm super proud of the brand that I'm being able to build under the current music that I put out there.
And of course, the best place to look if we want to know what you're up to is BrendanRothwell.com, if I'm not mistaken.
You are never mistaken, as you well know. I don't think I've ever seen you be mistaken. BrendanRothwell.com.
I edit out my mistaken parts, but thank you.
Oh, genius. I should have known. So the website under my own name, most things are kind of stored there. If I'm doing some live stuff, it'll be there. If there's recordings, there's links there. Yeah, I will plug this little piece as well. The CD format, we've been told since about the mid-1990s that CD's going away, right? Of course. And in my lifetime, we've gone from vinyl being the only real medium to play music from to now the world of WAV files and MP3s and lossless audio and all these things. CD is actually still a big thing for people that want to buy the physical music, whether it's, the Hayoka's Mirror rock world or my own stuff. And because of the lockdown, so many more people are at home right now. They're listening to music. And I've had a ton of people come through the website and say, hey, Sentiment, it's doing really well. It had a #1. It's not sure. And I got time on my hands as well. So those are certainly available. So the main website, also, at Rothwell Bass, you'll find me using that name on platforms like Instagram. Facebook is out there. I have a Twitter account. I tweet infrequently as a bass player. I'm not sure if bass players are supposed to tweet or not. But I use that from time to time. More usually if it's some sort of bigger announcement or a bigger show or whatever it may be. But the Instagram thing is kind of cool. A lot of people like to connect on that platform, and Facebook is Facebook. And I'm 50. Right? What would I know? It used to be the Facebook. So.
Oh, very cool. Well, Brendan, we appreciate you taking time to share some of the insights of your journey to tell us about your gear, to tell us about the future plans. We're looking forward with a bated breath to upcoming projects, whether they be on the metal vein or whether they're in the smooth jazz vein. Folks, you've seen him here, Brendan Rothwell, coming to you live on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thanks so much. Keep it low. We'll chat soon.